Windover is a shallow, peat-bottomed pond where early archaic people buried their dead roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. The peat's chemistry preserved not only their skeletons, but brain tissue, textiles, and wooden artifacts, materials that almost never survive. This is Forgotten Threads. My name is Beth Perdue, and I'm your storyteller for today. Now, I did not have a postcard because, as you can imagine, we are dealing with a subject that is 7, 8, maybe 9,000 years old, and it's not like they had a post office or postcards or really much of that stuff. So I made one. Or should I say AI made one for me. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. There's not like a massive amount of things for you to go and see here, but I did want to stick with the vintage look that I love with the postcards and do something for Windover. Much has been written about Windover and the incredible finds unearthed there, but my interest lies in the fabrics found and in the lifestyles of the people who made them. Remember, this is all about connecting the forgotten threads. I don't buy into the idea that early man was somehow unintelligent or simple. I think these people had skills that were in some ways far superior to our own today. The 168 individuals uncovered at Windover prove this in many ways, a number that represents more than half of all Paleo-American skeletons ever found in North America, and there is probably more to be discovered. For those who don't know the story, let me give a short background on Windover and the archaeology of the area. Florida is not young when it comes to archaeology. In fact, we boast some of the oldest known civilizations on the continent, and the archaeological record attests to a thriving ancient Florida, thousands upon thousands of people living in well-maintained, organized communities. Not all of these communities were stationary. Some were nomadic. I'm not painting a rosy picture of lives that were somehow very easy. But I also don't want to leave the impression that ancient Florida was a wasteland, because it was anything but. In 1982, land was being cleared for a new subdivision called Windover Farms. While a backhoe operator was working the pond, human skulls turned up in the muck. Archaeologist Glenn Doran from Florida State University was called in to examine the remains. He initially first thought that they were somewhere around 1,000 years old and possibly Native American. But after testing, it was determined that the bodies were somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 years old, thousands of years older than the pyramids in Egypt. In the end, around 168 bodies were found beneath the peat. Here is a basic little timeline of the events to kind of paint a broader picture to give you more insight into the people that worked here. During the discovery and recognition part of this aspect, it was basically from 1982 to 1983. This is where the backhoe comes into play. While demucking the pond to build this Windover Farm subdivision, locally located roughly halfway between Walt Disney World and Cape Canaveral, backhoe operator Steve Vanderyaet, I think that's how you say it, Vanderyaet, noticed an unusual number of rocks in the sandy pond and stopped to investigate. He uncovered a pile of human bones and immediately called the authorities. His decision to stop and report the find preserved the site, which led to a wealth of knowledge. The coroner rules the remains ancient people of some kind. The Brevard County Medical Examiner determined the bones were not those of a recent homicide, but were very old, and referred them to the anthropology department at Florida State University. Developer and landowner Jim Swan initially stored the remains in his garage and a construction trailer before pursuing expert help. In 1982, Glenn Doran is called in. Swan contacted FSU archaeologist Glenn Doran, a young professor who was the first to recognize the site's extraordinary potential. Doran assessed the bones as Native American. Subsequent radiocarbon dating stunned everyone by returning ages of 7,000 to 8,000 years old, older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt and King Tutankhamun. In 1982, or the period between 1982 and 1984, funding is assembled in order to help with the archaeological site. The developer, EKS Corporation, financed the initial radiocarbon dating. Recognizing the significance, the developer gave his blessing to excavate, later receiving the U.S. Interior Department's Public Service Award, and the Florida legislature provided a grant. It took about 2 years to raise the money for a systematic dig. Then in the period between 1984 and 1986, this is when the excavations began. Under Doran's leadership as principal investigator, 3 field seasons got underway. Because the pond was water saturated, crews first installed a well point pumping system that removed thousands of gallons per hour, allowing archaeologists to maintain tight control over the position of every find comparable to a dry site. The finds began to accumulate, and in the period between 1984 and 1986, excavations recovered more than 160 human burials, ultimately reported as up to 168, many fully articulated and staked into the pond bottom. Roughly 1/3 of the skulls preserved brain tissue. Recovered grave goods included the oldest textiles in the Southeast, plus wooden, bone, antler, and stone artifacts, all documented by a multidisciplinary team. Then in 1986, the excavation concludes. Roughly half of the pond was excavated. Doran maintained that significant cultural material remained buried in the unexcavated peat and the surrounding lots. Artifacts were distributed to Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science in Cocoa, Florida, and the Florida State University. The Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, I love small local museums, and this is a really great one. You can see a lot of artifacts that are from all over Florida, but mainly dealing with, of course, Brevard County, and the fantastic finds that have been able to be unearthed here between the paleo animals to dinosaurs to what we would consider dinosaurs, things that lived thousands of years ago, all the way up through to the Windover peat bog bodies that were found. Some of the discoveries were absolutely incredible. What struck me most was the existence of brain matter still inside the skulls. In one case, the remains of an elderly woman's last meal were still in her stomach. The find was beyond historical. The interesting part about DNA, I did a short little TikTok video on this, and there were so many people who were interested in where did they come from? Who were these people? How did they get here? And who do they most resemble genetically in the world today? To kind of find, I guess, their home, their genetic lineage. And so a lot of work has been done in this field. The DNA extracted proved that the families represented here used this site for more than 1,300 years. Now, that is somewhat disputed. However, I have heard a couple of other different takes on it. I guess year-wise, how long it has actually been used, but I'm just telling you what I have uncovered so far. Further excavation uncovered implements from their daily lives, showing that they didn't simply bury these people without thought. Quite the opposite. Great thought and care went into each individual's burial. Many were wrapped in fabric. It isn't believed they were wrapped the way the Egyptians embalmed their dead, but rather garments or blankets were placed over them at burial. The fabric uncovered is thought to be the oldest found in the New World. Similar fabric has been found in caves out west, but the weave there is simpler. A complex weave, like Windover's, indicates these people had time to participate in crafts, not just the making of fabric for modesty or utilitarian purposes, but weaving as a skill in its own right. James Adavasio, a specialist in ancient fabrics and basketry at the University of Pittsburgh, described one piece this way. He said, the Florida specimen, which measures at least 18 inches by 11 inches, was made with single-stranded warp filaments and triple-stranded weft threads. As weft intercepts warp, it does not simply pass alternately under and over as in loom woven fabrics. Instead, the strands of a weft thread separate at each warp, pass over and under, and are twisted back together on either side of the warp. There are about 16 wefts and 9 warps per inch. It's an incredible thing, absolutely unique at that age. The fabric is unique, and it gives us a look not only into the lives of these people, but into the very threads they use and where those threads came from. The fabric, the brain matter, the implements, each could be a rich study in and of itself. So where do these people come from? As to the origins of the people group, there is still some speculation. There are plenty of differing views and information that is out there And we'll get to some of that. The preserved brain tissue is what made the question answerable at all. It's almost unheard of. Remarkably well preserved brain tissue was recovered from 91 skulls, and DNA from that tissue has been sequenced. The state of preservation even allowed researchers to determine that the bodies were buried in the peat within 24 to 48 hours after death. What is incredible, there is a book, and I will post a picture of the book right here. This book is so interesting because there are tons of photos throughout the whole book, but it also has a picture of the brain, and I literally thought that when you hear that brains existed inside these heads that you were able to get DNA from, I really was just thinking it was probably just a pile of mush. It was nothing really to be identified as a brain, but it really actually looks like a brain. Like, you cannot mistake it for anything else. It's pretty incredible. The landmark study was published in Nature in 1986 by Doran, Dickel, Ballinger, Agee, Lapis, and Hasworth. It analyzed preserved human bone and soft matter discovered in 1984 through 1985 in the pond, representing a minimum of 40 individuals of both sexes in various ages. Corrected radiocarbon dates from bone and peat gave consistent ages in the range of 7,790 to 8,290 years before present. 9 individuals had intracranial soft matter, and in 5 of these, material recognizable as preserved or replaced brain tissue was present. Further analysis demonstrated gross anatomical features, remnant cellular structure, and human DNA. This mattered because both early ancient DNA studies had involved dried tissue, so Windover showed that a water-saturated environment could preserve DNA as well. A follow-up study appeared in 1991 titled 8,000-Year-Old Human Brain Tissue from the Windover Site, Anatomical, Cellular, and Molecular Analysis. The most cited finds across the research is that the Windover people don't map neatly onto living populations. According to the Orange County Regional History Center, the DNA extracted from the skeletal remains, rather than the more fragile brain tissue, yielded the most interesting results. The people buried at Windover migrated to the North America from Asia, but do not seem to be related to any living Native American tribes or to any known prehistoric people groups. So the testing determined they were of Asian descent. That still doesn't tell us how they came to this corner of the southern United States. Interestingly, some of the burial methods used at Windover can be found in other parts of the world, such as southern Sweden, southern Finland, and Karelia. The ancestors of the Windover people came from Northeast Asia, Siberia, by way of Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia and Alaska when sea levels were far lower during the Ice Age. Beringia is the region straddling the Bering Strait, the stretch between easternmost Siberia and Alaska, where the Pacific and Arctic Oceans meet. Today, it's underwater. But during the Ice Age, lower sea levels exposed it as dry land, so they could just walk straight across from country to country. By the time of the Windover Cemetery, people had already been living in Florida for something like 6,000 years or more. The Windover people weren't recent arrivals working their way down the continent. They were a long-established, regional-rooted population, many thousands of years removed from the original crossing. That deep local rootedness fits the genetic distinctiveness the studies found. An early lineage that had been in place a very long time and eventually didn't survive into the present. And as for how long the journey took, the framing doesn't quite match reality. This wasn't one migration, but many generations of gradual expansion over millennia. The crossing from Alaska to the Gulf Coast, once underway, could unfold over roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years, but no single individual or family ever traveled to Florida, so to speak. Each generation simply lived a little further along than the last. So it's this migration of, like we see in a lot of indigenous people groups, where they would move with herds or move with the land, and so you had this nomadic sort of way of living. And honestly, it's kind of how we live today. In a lot of ways, we can't find a job, or we are not being successful in one area or a part of the world, and so we have perfect freedom and ability to move or to go somewhere else, try a different thing, have a different job. So this nomadic ability for people to move. And so as they started the process, it took a long time for them to move. It wasn't like they were just on a journey to start out to go to Florida, which of course didn't exist. What is interesting about Windover is that the people cared about each other. And again, this goes back to the fact that we have this idea in our heads that somehow these ancient people were just brutal all the time, and that they had no compassion and no care and didn't care anything about their own or anyone else. And I think we can see in not only the civilization at Windover, but in other civilizations that this is just not actually the case, that they actually cared about their people and cared about life. Life was important. Windover is quite possibly proof that these ancient people lived relatively long lives and enjoyed both their surroundings and each other. The clearest sign of that is a boy who was buried there with spinal bifida. He had been cared for. Archaeologists read his burial as a direct evidence of compassion in a very ancient community. Because of his age, we can see he was not killed at birth for being weak nor abandoned to die. He was cared for, and he lived many years before succumbing to what was likely a fatal infection. His case is usually cited alongside another, a woman of roughly 50. Together, these burials led Florida State researchers to conclude that under some conditions, life 7,500 years ago included real care for the sick and the disabled, challenging the stereotype of prehistoric life as uniformly brutal and short. The boy was buried with the same care shown to everyone at Windover, wrapped and placed deliberately, not tossed in, and notably, children and teenagers at Windover were buried with more grave goods than adults, a sign of the high value the community placed on its young. The textiles they chose to include in those burials point to exactly that.